So I would like to give introduction to Professor Suzanne de Treville. So she is Professor of Operations Management at the University of Lausanne. So she currently serves as co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Operations Management. She served as Dean of Business Group from 2006 to 2009. She has been a frequent visiting professor at MIT Sloan School. Her expertise is quantifying the cost of expanding the supply chain, reducing lead time, and using the resulting insights for strategic advantage. The cost differential frontier app developed by her laboratory is used by the US and Swiss governments to better understand how to manufacture locally. Her work has been published in journals such as Journal of Operations Management, Production and Operations Management, the Harvard Business Review, the International Journal of Production Economics, and Interfaces. Professor de Treville received her doctoral degree from the Harvard Business School and her master's and undergraduate degrees from Carnegie Mellon University. So may I invite all of you to join me welcoming Professor de Treville. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much for that nice introduction. So can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes, I can see your screen, yeah.
Perfect, wonderful. So we are going to, everybody, these days, everybody is talking about supply chain responsiveness and resilience. But we can't really make a decision about whether to prioritize responsiveness and resilience until we are able to estimate what the value is. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's take an example from apparel. So we have a fashion jacket and a standard jacket. So the fashion jacket we sell for 100. If we produce it offshore with a distant supplier with a long lead time, it's going to cost us 40. And if we produce it locally, then the variable cost is going to be 20. The fixed cost is going to be 30. So it's going to cost us 50. So that means that we are going to be paying a 25% premium for local production. And if we produce or order a fashion jacket and we don't sell it during the demand period, then we can't sell it the next demand period. We throw it away, it goes into landfill. We know that apparel is the second dirtiest industry on the planet after petroleum. And this is part of the reason for that. And you say, well, why can't you give it away? You know, and the fact is that there is not a country on this globe that is poor enough to want these leftover clothes. Everybody is drowning in extra clothes. So if we don't use it, we throw it away. Standard jackets sell for 35. If we produce it offshore, it costs 30. If we produce it locally, we have the same fixed cost of 30 and the variable cost is 10. So locally, it's going to be 40, which is going to be a 33% premium for local production. And we notice that if we have a fully loaded cost, that means we're going to sell the jacket at a loss. But the good thing about standard jackets is that if we have a leftover jacket, we can sell it next period at full price, but we will incur a holding cost of 5. So now we have the question, when should we consider local production, or should we ever consider local production? So we have some common decision rules that we observe decision makers follow. One of these is we're going with the lowest per unit cost, you know, kind of a type of what's called a take the best heuristic. We're going to reduce the decision to a single number, which is the lowest, maybe the lowest landed cost, but per unit cost. And whatever alternative is the lowest cost, we're going with it. Or we have what I call the MBA solution, somebody sitting in the front row who raises their hand and says, I know, let's just produce the fashion jackets locally, and then we produce a standard jacket offshore, all good. Remember that MBA solution. We'll come back to that later. Another thing is that people tend to go after measures of central tendency. So they might go for the median, they might go to the mean, but they want to go to something central. Now let's suppose that I have a whole bunch of people in a discussion and I say, so should we consider producing this locally? It does cost 25 to 33% more. And there will be some people in the room who are observing the fact that when you lose production, it is very bad for your entire economy at a lot of levels. And they say, we just need to produce it locally. I know it's more expensive, but we just need to do it. It's just the right thing to do. So it's kind of this blind faith approach. But the interesting thing is what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be playing some competitive games. And when you put these people who are saying, we have to do this, the future of our children and grandchildren's at stake, we put them in front of a competitive game. What do? They offshore. People are funny. So let's establish some useful things. One thing is that we tend not to have very good historical data with demand a lot of the time, especially for something like a fashion product. And so that can make it hard to get started. We need to have some idea of a reasonable density of demand. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be assuming that demand is log normally distributed. And I'll be explaining more about that later. But for the moment, we're just going with it. And so when we play the competitive game, we are going to give you expected demand, mean demand, and median demand. And given that we're assuming a log normal distribution, that lets us estimate the volatility from comparing those two numbers, because we know that for log normally distributed distributions, the mean is equal to the product of the median times e to the sigma squared over 2. All good. So we don't have historical data, and we're comparing, similar seasons. Each year is drawn from the same distribution, but we have been able to determine that expected demand is 120 jackets per selling season for the fashion jacket, and expected demand is 204 jackets per selling season for the standard jacket. And median demand is estimated at 100 for the fashion and 200 for the standard jacket. So we have the mean, we have the median, we estimate the volatility, then for the fashion jacket as being 60%, and for the standard jacket, it is 20%. So if there are any questions, put them in the chat. Now, I have my screen set up so that I don't see the chat to not lose my focus. But then when we get to the end, I will look at the questions that are there and do what I can in the time that we have. And then also, if there are important questions for clarification, then I will ask one of the organizers to jump in and let me know that there's an important question. So 60% volatility for the fashion and 20% for the standard. Now, so given that we have this information, we can do a very basic news vendor calculation. So let's walk through it. Let's consider a fashion jacket that's produced offshore. So the question is, how much are we going to order if we get all of our fashion jackets offshore? So if we stock out, then we lose the difference between price and cost. So we lose 60. And if we buy a jacket that we don't sell, we lose 40 because we paid 40 and then we threw it away. So that gives us a critical fractile or a news vendor profit maximizing service level of 60%. So as usual, we take that 60% and we turn it into standard deviations. So that's going to be 0.25 standard deviations. And so our order quantity is going to be median demand, which is 100, times e to the z sigma. So we take e to the 0.25 times, we saw the volatility was 0.6 earlier, and that's going to give us 116.5. And the general rule is when in doubt, you round up. So we're going to go with 117. Please hold the number 117 in your mind. The fill rate is going to be 75%. Here's the formula. This formula is not rocket science, but we could not find anywhere in the literature that tells you how to calculate the fill rate for log normal demand when you have standard deviations and volatility. So that we calculated it, and it is published in an appendix in one of the papers that I'll make available to you. But this is useful. So we've got a 60% service level, which means that if we place this order, then 60% of the time we're going to meet all demand, and we are going to satisfy 70% of demand, 75% of demand. So that gets us started with what we need to play the game. And so we're going to play the game. So here, we don't yet know our current year demand because we're ordering from an offshore supplier, so that we don't know yet what demand is. If we have jackets left over, they will show up here. This is how much we are going to order. This is how much we've sold. We see that median demand, this for the fashion jacket, is 100. Mean demand is 120. The offshore cost is 40. Holding cost doesn't apply because we make it, we don't sell it, we throw it away. Our selling price per unit is 100. And then here we're going to have our results. By the way, we will also keep track of how many units are scrapped. And when you produce a jacket and you put it in a container and you ship it halfway around the world or 3/4 the way around the world, then it is going to affect your carbon footprint. And we're going to remind you of that. Thank you. You're welcome. So how much do we want to order? So if I hadn't gone through the calculations, the news vendor analysis that we just did, and I asked the people here, I bet you people would go with 100 or 120 because people really like measures of central tendency. What we've seen is that the profit maximizing order is 117. So if you permit, I will go with our news vendor analysis. Now, I don't know what's going to happen because the game is going to draw randomly from a log normal distribution with a volatility of 0.6. Oh, this is a good year. So this year, yay, news vendor. Let's try it again. This year is not too bad. We end up scrapping 17 units, but we're making a profit. Oh, how can I have such a bad result when my news vendor analysis says that this is profit maximizing? Well, the thing is that when you have a log normal distribution with a median of 100, half the time it is going to be between 0 and 100. And the last time I checked, 67 was in fact between 0 and 100. So this is perfectly likely to happen. What this means is that we're now up to 67 scrapped units. we are still making money, but we're not making as much money, and things are not so great. And we can play one more just to see if anything else exciting happens. I don't know whether it will or not. Oh, randomly. Yes. So let's think about what just happened. Demand for this fashion jacket is 170. This is an awesome year. Do you know how much money we could have made if we could have met all of that demand? Unfortunately, we're limited to 117. This is basically what the news vendor model does to us. It says that 40% of the time, demand is going to be higher than 117, and we're going to lose out. So this brings to mind a real option that you are limited in terms of the upside. All right, so let me go back. So we have just experienced a couple of years that were perfectly good. One year where we ended up eating a lot of inventory, and one year that would have been absolutely glorious, and we sadly watched it pass us by. Does that sound like real life in supply chain? I think it does. So now people say, we really should consider responsiveness or resilience, and we should invest in this, we should produce locally, etc. And so let's ask the question, should we consider the 25 to 33% cost premium for local production? So we're comparing local production to order. So let's say that if we produce locally, we figure out what demand is, and then we make what is needed. So we're trading off lower cost production for increased supply chain risk when we order offshore. So we're going to look at the relative decision lead time. Let me take a moment to talk about what I mean by decision lead time. Note, this is not the delivery lead time. This is the decision lead time. The decision lead time says that it's 0 if I am able to decide what to produce or what to order when I know demand. And it's 1, we'll normalize it to 1 for the longest lead time alternative that is on the table. So here we have a long lead time option, and we have a local supplier with a decision lead time of 0. So we observe demand, and then we commit production. So answering this question is the job of the Cost Differential Frontier app that we developed, and I'll make these slides available after the talk. Here is the address that takes you directly to my lab. And here's the address if you would like to see what the path through the US government's website looks like. So we're going to go directly to my lab. All right, so let me actually start from the beginning so that you can take it. So the default values here can be replaced by the ones that match the situation that you would like to analyze. And this is freely available, and you have the address. So in this case, if we produce or if we order the jacket offshore, we're going to pay 40. The residual value, how much of the value that we retain if we don't sell the jacket during the season, in this case, for the fashion jacket, it's going to be 0. The volatility parameter is 0.6. We calculated that by comparing the mean and the median. But let me show you a little tool that we added in just to make it easier for managers and non-statistician decision makers to have some intuition about volatility. So let's imagine that peak demand is 3 times median demand, and that a demand peak occurs 1 in 10 times. If we have a log normal distribution, then we can estimate that volatility is on the order of 86%. Now let's suppose that peak demand is twice median demand 1 month a year. That gives us a 50% volatility. And if it is, let's say, 2.5 times 14, 15. So with a demand volatility of 0.6, that's going to be something along the lines of, oh, I can even do it better. Let's say it's twice median demand, 1 in 8 times. So now we're saying, okay, so imagine a demand peak, and how big is it compared to the median, without having to talk about what the peak and the median are, and then how often do they occur. And then this little calculator lets you have a discussion. So what we're saying is, we started with the mean and the median. This also means that a demand peak, when it occurs, is twice median demand, and it happens 1 period out of 8. So hopefully that is clear. And what I want to emphasize is trying to have the tool so that people can talk about it and feel like they know what they're talking about. It's not magic. It's not a black box. So we add the curve. Let's take a look at this. So we were very concerned about paying a 25% cost premium for local production because that's just so much money. But what this shows us is that we should be ready to pay a 59% premium to eliminate the demand risk exposure. So this tends to be very surprising. And it was when the US Department of Commerce saw this, they said, oh, this is what we need. If we have this information, then the decision to produce locally becomes quite easy. So I was delighted to help them make it available. Let's take the next step in thinking about what we're going to do to be able to do these calculations and make this kind of recommendation. So the first thing that we need to think about is, what is our forecast evolution scenario? So there are a few common forecast evolution scenarios, and actually I've now been working with this for around 15 years. And one of these forecast evolution scenarios has sufficed for every situation I've faced. So there can be no forecast evolution, which means right now, I know what demand is. If I go back 1 instant in time, I know what demand is going to be. I go back a week in time, I know exactly what demand is going to be. It just doesn't change. I've never seen a case like that, but I can see that it's theoretically possible. Then I can have constant information arrivals or constant instantaneous volatility, which would take the form of either a Brownian or a geometric Brownian motion. So the idea is that right now, I know what demand is. I go back 1 second in time, I have a little jolt. So I know a little bit, my things are a little bit noisier. I go back 2 seconds in time, I have another jolt. Every second I have a jolt. So if the jolts are additive, Then we have a Brownian motion, and we're going to have a normal marginal density. If the jolts are multiplicative, then they are going to give us a log normal marginal density. Now, if you try to work with a normal distribution with demand for any reasonable volatility, you're going to end up with negative demand, and the right tail is going to be way too thin. So it's going to be a problem. It is going to tell you wrong things anytime the question is interesting. Log normal, you get away from all the bad stuff, tends to be good enough. So I now have gotten, with my students, I get very aggressive that you go in there and you assume that log normal is good enough. It's going to be wrong. But what we're doing is based on Black-Scholes option pricing. And everybody has known for many decades that Black-Scholes is only approximately right. You have volatility, smiles, et cetera, but it's what everybody uses because it's good enough. It takes you in the right direction. It lets you have the right conversation. So I say, just whatever questions people ask you, you say, log normal at least gets us started. Now, some of the ways in which a log normal would be incorrect would be if you have clustered information arrivals, which would be a stochastic instantaneous volatility. One of the papers that I'll mention, I have a slide with links to papers, actually presents derivation of stochastic instantaneous volatility version of the cost differential frontier. And it's interesting, but the main thing that you come away with is that if you actually have stochastic instantaneous volatility, then it pushes the frontier up. So you can use the cost differential frontier with constant instantaneous volatility as giving you a lower bound. You say, if you actually have this, stochastic instantaneous volatility is how we get the bullwhip effect. I saw that Hao Li was one of the visitors that you had to your seminar. So if you have the bullwhip effect, then what you do with the cost differential frontier that I showed you is going to be a lower bound. You can also have a jump where you have at some point in time a shift and a shift in median demand as opposed to resolving demand uncertainty. And that can be interesting. And if it turns out that you've got a shift in median demand because you've got a product that just took off, then it might be worth doing some extra work. So, but 99 times out of 100, my suggestion is go log normal. Now, once we define the forecast evolution process, what happens is that lead time becomes a decision variable. So let's take a look at what this looks like with a marginal log normal density and a relative decision lead time T. Now, when we take the longest alternative that's on the table, then we will set T equal to 1. We're normalizing the longest option to 1. And the natural log of demand is going to be normally distributed with mean and variance. So our order quantity is going to be E to the mu plus Z sigma. So this is where where Z is our profit maximizing number of standard deviations. So we see that this is the product of E to the mu, which is our median, times E to the Z sigma, which is we can think of as being a multiplicative safety stock, E to the Z sigma. So our order quantity then as a multiple of median demand is going to be our E to the Z sigma, is going to be distributed, the log of that is going to be normally distributed, the mean is going to be 0, and then we will have the volatility squared. Now, as we consider relative decision lead times that are between 0 and 1, then the natural log of our order quantity as a multiple of median demand is going to be normally distributed. And then the variance is going to be T sigma squared. So it's another, it's a nice example of a square root rule. So we have three strategies. We can go offshore only. We can have fashion jackets local only, or we can do something hybrid where we have some local capacity. So we produce our first fashion jackets offshore, and then if we have local capacity, then we can top it up. So let's take a look at standard jackets, and let's do a quick news vendor analysis. So our critical fractile is going to be 0.5 because if we have demand for a jacket and we don't have the jacket, then we lose 35 minus 30. Our price is 35 and our offshore cost is 30. If we have one jacket too many, it's going to cost us a holding cost of 5. So we put this together and we come up with a critical fractile of 0.5. So ordering at the median is correct in this case. And our fill rate is going to be 91%. So we satisfy all demand 50% of the time, and we satisfy 91% of demand when we order at the median. And the median, I remind you, is 200 jackets, 200 standard jackets. Now, let's think about the situation where we are going to produce fashion jackets local only. Now, this might not be the cheapest approach, but I think it's useful to think about producing all of our fashion jackets locally. So if we have an extra unit of capacity, what are we going to do with it? So we recall that the standard jacket, if we produced it fully costed locally, was going to lose money because the fixed cost is 30. The variable cost is 10, that's 40, and we receive a price of 35. So that means we're losing 5. But with our news vendor analysis, we're saying, we have an extra unit of capacity, and we could let it sit idle, in which case we get nothing, or we could use it to produce a standard jacket. We're already paying the 30, so that's a sunk cost. So we pay the variable cost of 10, and then it would be a total of 40 as opposed to the 30 that we would have paid offshore. So that means it's 10 more expensive if fully costed. So our cost of an extra unit of capacity is going to be 10. If we stock out, then we lose the difference between the price of 100 minus the 20 plus 30 for a fashion jacket. So our critical fractile is going to be 0.83, which is going to be 0.97 standard deviations. So our target capacity is going to be 179.4. Now, in the game, you're going to see that, like often happens in real life, capacity comes on in intervals. In this case, it's 25 units at a time. So we're going to set capacity to 200 units. If we round up, we could drop down to 175. I'm going to follow the roundup rule. And so 200 units, we can calculate represents 1.15 standard deviations. So we put this 1.15 into our fill rate calculation, and we say, 91.6% fill rate. Now, given the fact that median demand is 100, and we're going to have 200 units of capacity, this means that most of the time we are going to have some leftover capacity. So let's quickly calculate what that is. So we have our expected demand, which is 120. We have our fill rate, which we just saw was 91.6%. So that means that our expected sales are 109.9, call it 110. So if we're selling 110 on average, and we had 200 units of capacity, that means that our expected leftover capacity is going to be the 200 minus the 110 is going to be 90. Now, please recall that our order for standard jackets offshore was 200. So we're going to stick with that 200, but now we're going to adjust it for the fact that we expect to make 90 jackets locally, 90 standard jackets locally. So we are going to order 110 standard jackets offshore, and we are going to invest in 200 units of local capacity. So let me show you what that looks like. So now we see that we have the same information, but it goes to fashion and standard jackets. We see the median, mean yearly demand, the offshore cost per unit, the local variable cost per unit, local fixed cost per unit, the holding cost, selling price per unit, etc. And the game developer decided to start off the game with the requirement of having 25 units of capacity. Most people say it's too expensive. We just can't afford the capacity. Every unit of capacity costs 30. And he said, you know what? You're stuck with it. So what we're going to do is follow the strategy that I just told you about. And you're going to have a lot of decision makers going, it's too expensive, it just can't be done. Look, we've already spent 6,000 euros. That is so much money. So because we are making all of our fashion jackets locally, this is going to be 0. And then we recall that our standard jackets are 110. So take a moment to think about what we're doing. And remember, alternatively, if we were producing our fashion jackets offshore, we would have ordered 117. There a question? Okay, great. Interesting. We have 200 units of capacity, and fashion demand is 190. So that means we say, oh, it's 190. Fine. Let's go have a coffee. Or better yet, some really good tea. And then we say, well, we've got 10 units of leftover capacity, so we'll just use them to make standard jackets. We're going to stock out on the standard jackets, but who cares? We're in this business because we're good at fashion jackets, and we just had a fabulous year. And because we had the local capacity, we're making a lot of money. We are making 10,000 euros in profit. And that's completely crazy because we spent we spent an extra 25% for every unit that we produced. So let's play another year. Again, 0 for offshore, and we're again going to go with 110. Ooh, this is not such a good year. Maybe everybody bought jackets last year, and we just don't know. This year, they're less excited about our jacket for whatever reason. And we say this is unfortunate. Somebody should talk to the designers and see if we can do better, try to understand what's going on. But at least we are not scrapping any jackets, and we didn't make them to throw them away and put them into landfill. So demand is 52. We wish that it would have been higher than that, but we are grateful that we don't have to make more than that. And then the rest goes into standard jackets. And we're putting 88 standard jackets into storage. We'll just order less next year. So our cumulative profit isn't quite as high, but it's still pretty good. So let's play again. The standard jacket, we normally order 110, but now we are going to order less because we have 88 in stock. So we're going to do 22. And that gives us our 110. Now, I tricked you. That's not nice. Sorry. Because you see, we've been talking about demand volatility exposure, and all of the calculations that we've done are assuming log normal demand and demand volatility of 60%, 20% for the standard jacket. But when we're in a real supply chain, real stuff happens, like quality problems. So, breaking news, there was a major quality problem. Only 20% of the period's offshore production can be sold. The rest must be scrapped. So we ordered 22 units and 18 of them got scrapped. Oops. But thank heavens we're not scrapping fashion jackets. So we have a perfectly reasonable fashion demand, not brilliant, but between median and mean. And then the rest we will try to make up for. It's a good thing we had the 88 jackets in stock. Things could be a lot worse. And by the way, even though we have had crazy things happen in our supply chain, we're making money. And it's so funny because we're spending so much money. We have such a not low cost producer. All right, let's play again. We're going to be back to 110. Not a great year. So that the fashion is 91. Look at this. We have some more real life. This time what happened was, due to a lack of containers available, our shipment from the offshore supplier will not arrive on time for the selling season. Oh, well. So what that means is that we're not going to have much in the way of standard jackets. The 110 are not going to arrive. So again, we're pretty happy to have had a local capacity. And we, even with this crazy event of most of the jackets that we ordered not coming because they're stuck in a container, we still made a profit. And we're going to play one more year. We are again going to order 110. Breaking news. You see, when we got the local production, it meant that our customer, instead of being completely hands-off, has started to talk to us about the demand risk that they are facing. And so they call you and they say, you know, we ordered jackets that we thought were going to sell, but it now turns out that there's this other jacket that we hadn't even thought of that is going to sell super well. And if you can produce 60 units, we will pay a price of 200 because this is what people want. And so can you be that flexible? And we say, sure, why not? Okay, so that means that we're going to put 60 here. And then, oh, by the way, it's also a great year for regular, fashion jackets. So we're going to produce 133. And then whatever is left, which is not very many, we're going to put two standard jackets. And there we have it. So that this means that we ended up making a profit of 32,815 euros, paying a fortune for the production of our jackets. How can this happen? Well, what it causes you to realize is the real money, the real profit doesn't only come from paying a low cost, but it comes from being able to go for opportunities and avoid crazy stuff that happens to you. So what we have discovered is that we can teach people all of the equations that I've shown you. And they say, got it. They can get full points on, every exam. They go in, they can't make the decision. But after they've played the game a few times, starting by saying everything offshore, I know the professor thinks that local works, I want to win, and then they lose. There's really nothing like losing. So we've discovered that games make people make better decisions. I had mentioned that we could, with quite a bit more work, come up with a hybrid strategy. If you were a student in my full semester course, you would need to know how to do this. And we would calculate that a fashion offshore order should be 61. We have a 125 of local capacity, and a standard offshore order would be 126 net of expected leftover capacity. So this is interesting to think about. If we go offshore only, that has the lowest profit, even though it's the cheapest cost. If we produce all fashion jackets locally, expected profit goes up by 5% if we don't have any events. Producing fashion jackets both offshore and locally increases expected profit by 15% relative to offshore only. Again, in the absence of events. But the events are actually a very realistic part of our story because real supply chains have real events. So this brings us to the difference between responsiveness and resilience. So I would like to suggest that responsiveness here concerns the known unknowns, the demand, volatility, exposure, but then got stuck in a container, or the supplier said, oh, hey, can you make this for us? And you're like, yeah, and we'll pay you a fortune. These things are follow-on options, and they represent a lot of money. So it's definitely worth considering. So this brings us to the idea of what we call option-based costing. So remember the MBA student who said, I know, produce all the fashion jackets locally and produce all the standard jackets offshore. But we have this very nice interaction between the fashion jackets and the standard jackets locally, that we did make more money using leftover capacity to produce standard jackets. It was a bit more expensive, but it kept the capacity used. By the way, in real life, then things are not as simple as in this game. So you would have the fashion jacket that would be very time sensitive, but then you would have some jackets that would be not as profitable or as risky as the fashion jacket, but better than the standard jacket. So with leftover capacity, there might be some quite profitable things that you can do. What we have found is that having decision makers understand the local capacity in terms of a very time sensitive product and a very time insensitive product, and really try to get the tension between those two, that tends to work very well. And then if they find themselves with other options to use the leftover capacity, they just make more money and they're happy. So for time sensitive, high margin products, we suggest taking the cost of the capacity buffer, the fixed cost includes labor and overhead, and we allocate it, all of it, for all 200 units of capacity to these high margin products as an option cost. And then we use the leftover capacity to make standard products. Those standard products are completely competitive with low wage competitors because the labor is already paid for. The variable cost tends not to be that different. So that what it means is we have just created a low wage competitor in the middle of our local capacity. Now I put on my operations strategy hat. This is an incredibly powerful strategic weapon. So here are some insights from our simple example. We've looked at the concepts of forecast evolution and decision lead time. We have looked at the difference between risk, for example, demand volatility, and uncertainty, which we illustrated using events. We discussed the importance of thinking in terms of a product portfolio rather than just focusing on the per unit cost. We brought up the concept of option-based costing. We considered follow-on options that can occur. I would also like to point out that when we've talked about fashion jackets and we've talked about a demand volatility of 60%, we haven't talked about the fact that jackets come in sizes: extra small, small, medium, large, extra large, extra, extra large, extra, extra small, and they come in different colors. So how many times does it happen that you go into a department store and you see something that's exactly what you want, and you see exactly the color that you want, and you also see a color that you do not want, and they have the color that you do not want in your size, and they do not have your size for the color that you do want, and so you leave and you don't buy anything. So we haven't even gone there. So what are the implications of getting it right and correctly valuing these options? The first thing is we're more competitive because responsiveness and resilience are going to do an awful lot more for you strategically than low cost. We create opportunities for customization and servitization. I suggest that we get real power out of our supply chain when manufacturing becomes a service operation that happens to deliver a product. Innovation. Innovation follows manufacturing because much of the creation occurs during production. So now that we have local production, we can innovate. Sustainability. So when we are producing offshore, where it is less, the per unit cost is lower, then it may well be profit maximizing to place an order or produce 3 times median demand. That means we're going to be throwing stuff away all the time. Even if we do this in a green factory, making stuff to throw away is not sustainable. Is not sustainable. What about employee growth? When we think about factories in low-cost countries, they tend to run 20-second cycle times, miserable working condition, and employees not only get terrible repetitive strain injuries, but they're limited in their ability to learn. So when we invest in the manufacturing locally, there's a lot that we can do to support longer cycle times and give employees the chance to take on additional responsibility. So a few takeaways. What we're doing is using basic models from quantitative finance that we have reshaped so that we can value and identify the real options that underlie responsiveness. I have shown you some of the decision support tools that my lab has created. These options increase profitability, innovation, sustainability, and jobs that make it possible for workers to grow. I had promised to give you a list of some of the papers with our published work in case anybody's interested in exploring this further. Otherwise, I suggest that we take a few minutes for questions, and then I'll share a little bit about the journal.
Yes. So thank you, Professor de Treville. So would you like to also present something on Journal of Operations Management?
Yes. And
yeah. Or would you like to yeah, so it's your preference. So you would like to answer the questions first, or you would like to present the journal first?
Why don't I answer the questions first? That okay. Way, we're connected, and then if that
right.
takes 5 or 10 minutes, then I'll have enough time.
Okay, sure. So yes, so for those participants, if you have yeah, any questions for Professor de Treville's seminar, so please feel free to use the Q&A function and then to type your question, and so you may also put down your affiliation and name. Okay, so I think
I see
one
that,
question.
Yeah, I see there's a question from Derek. So
yes.
Hi, Derek. Thank you for your question. That the cost differential frontier is going to be, it's going to let you choose how much demand risk you're facing. And that is a good start. But you are correct that when unexpected events happen, things will be even worse. So here's what I suggest. If you try to plan for the next pandemic, or, well, actually, I have a version of the game where we do plan for the next pandemic. So let me start this over again, because we know that the next pandemic they come about every 10 years, and there are some possibilities that the next one would be even sooner. So some of these same tools, I'm arguing, should be used to rethink the vaccine supply chain. And I suggest that it should become a service instead of a product. Right now, you've got these very efficient factories that produce vaccines at like €3 per dose. But the problem is that when stuff happens, you easily end up with tons of the wrong vaccine and not having the right vaccine, or not having the right vaccine in the right place. Now, if we have a little compounding pharmacy, and if we get good at producing vaccines, looking at somebody's polymorphisms, like what are the things that would make them likely to have the clotting problem, or the myocarditis problem, and maybe add in a flu vaccine, and maybe something that works better for people who are older. We can produce a vaccine that is for a given person, and that gets pretty exciting. It's more expensive, but the mismatch costs are completely overwhelming. So back to your question. Yes, you know that in addition to the demand risk exposure, you're going to be facing other stuff. But what I think you'll find is that there is already so much money on the table that you can get the conversation started about having local capacity. And when you have local capacity, stuff happens to you and you don't have to deal with it because you're producing locally. So I say, use this to get started. If you try to bring everything in, it's going to be too hard to actually make progress. Because you know what? I've been working with this stuff for 15 years, and it is absolutely clear that if we have respect for local capacity, and if we move away from this lowest per unit cost, it's cheaper over there way of thinking, then everything is going to go better. So let's make that happen, because it is so hard even to get that happening. If we can do that, we're going to be better positioned to deal with other stuff. So I hope that gets you started. And then Julie Ann asked whether I've considered the impact of customized additive manufacturing in the game. So it might well be possible. Yeah, that's very easy to do. As soon as you have the event where your customer shows up and says, hey, can you make this? You can easily make it additive manufacturing. The underlying principle stays the same. So we've made various versions of the game, and it's very easy to do that. But the bottom line doesn't change. So I hope that that helps with that question. By the way, one of the things that we are able to do, if we have a company that's making decisions, we are able to create a version of the game specifically for that company. And that way they're looking, the supply chain managers can tell us what kinds of events they want to put in there. And then we can put a few more in just to make sure that a good time is had by all. So that our tool does not make assumptions on demographic and manufacturer. The only thing that we don't care about how customers behave. The results would not be affected. What we're doing is we're saying we're drawing from a log normal distribution, and the log normal distribution captures a wide range of customer behaviors. And so we don't have to go into you're from China, you're from Africa, you're from India, you're from Canada. It's just the easiest way to go about this is that peak to median ratio. Say, do you have demand peaks? How big are they compared to median? Now, often the manager that you're talking to isn't going to know the word median. And so you kind of don't want to scare the horses. So you say, so imagine a value where half of the time demand is lower, half the time demand is higher, and then look at a demand peak and how often do they happen? And like I did this once with the cosmetic company L'Oréal, and because they contacted me and they said, your students are showing up telling us to do things that we find very surprising, and we need to understand what your students are talking about. Can we meet with you? And I was like, sure. So we were having lunch, and they kind of were implying that they had some problems with mismatches. And so I said, so now without telling me what product it is, imagine a product where you're either having overstocks or understocks. And imagine this middle value where half the time demand is lower and half the time demand is higher. And now imagine a peak, and how high is the peak? And they said they both together, without talking to each other, immediately said twice. I'm like, huh. And I said, how often does it happen? And I was thinking in terms of, 1 in 10 or 1 in 8, that's kind of how my brain works. They said 2 weeks a year. I'm like, 2 weeks a year, 2 weeks for Christmas, 2 times in 50. I said 40% volatility. And then I used the cost differential frontier saying, is it 24% cheaper to produce all it? Because they had this big plant in Paris where they tried to produce for a year because it was cheaper. And I was like, is it 24% cheaper? I'm like, no, we need to understand what you're talking about. I'm like, you do. I think there is a lot of money here.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Professor de Treville. So may I also ask one question?
Sure.
So my question is, I would say your tool is very, very powerful and also practical. And I also appreciate that your tool is used by the US and Swiss governments, right? So I wonder, so to me, I mean, as an academic, it's extremely difficult to convince, let's say, the industry or the authority to use the tool. So would you like to share with us, so what were the challenges when you promote your tool to the governments, and also how you convince them?
So actually, that was quite easy, surprisingly. But what happened with the US government was we had just finished the tool, but it was in Java.
Yeah.
And I ended up, by just a pure coincidence, it was I was visiting at MIT, actually teaching together with David Centri-Levy. And it was a serious small world. And terrifying the MIT students with, this idea of geometric Brownian motion. So as a result, I was talking to Susan Helper, who was at that time the chief economist at the Department of Commerce. And I'm like, hey, Sue, look at this. And I showed her the cost differential frontier, and she's like, oh, this is what we need. Can we have it? I'm like, sure. She said, can we go live with it in 2 weeks? And would you please get it out of Java? So I contacted my university and I said, the US government needs us. So could I please have some money to get the tool recoded? They said, sure. So they gave me a few thousand francs. We got the tool recoded, went live. It went live on the Department of Commerce website. And then what happened was that some people from industry associations started using the tool. And then they would write to me and say, when we look at your tool, we realize that we should move at least half of our production locally. Would you look at our spreadsheet? Are we crazy? And I'm like, I'd love to look at your spreadsheet. So it was just great. And I've ended up doing some work with these people. And then when the US government went live with it, then Swiss journalists thought that was interesting. And so they published articles about it. Then what would happen was that companies in cantons that are like our states would end up in trouble where their production was being offshored. So they would go to the cantonal government, and people in the cantonal government would see articles about me, and they would say, there is this fairly eccentric professor in Lausanne who is doing things that might be useful. And so the government would contact me, and I would send one of my PhD students to work with the company. So we learned a lot. It was great. So basically, it's like climbing. I don't do rock climbing, but I know people who do rock climbing. And I see something, and it seems like there is just no way of getting a hold. And then they are able to get a hold. So we need to be like academic rock climbers. We need to be able to find the little place where we can put 1/30th of a fingernail and get a hold. And then when you get a hold, don't let go, and then things will change. But if you expect it to be easy, you will be disappointed. But if you expect it to be totally hard, but hey, there are worse ways of making a living and trying. And if we succeed, then the globe is going to be a better place for us and for our descendants, which I think is good.
So I strongly agree. Thank you, Professor de Treville. So it's not easy. I mean, the research is excellent, and at the same time, it has been applied in practice. I mean, making impact. Yeah, thank you very much, Professor de Treville. So may I now invite you? I think yeah, the audience are also very interested in the journal, a very prestigious journal, a journal of operations management. We are honored to have this opportunity to learn from you about this journal. Thank you very much.
Great. So can you see my slides?
Not yet.
Okay. So I am Zoom keeps coming up with new ways of
so you see the share screen, yeah, button.
So currently what I am seeing, I have two monitors, and I keep figuring out how to make it okay, so this might work. Maybe if I share the screen first, and then I move over there. And if that doesn't work, I will just be back.
Great. Yeah, I see it. Yeah, Journal of Operations Management. Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Wonderful. So Journal of Operations Management, it is a top tier journal, both in management and in operations and supply chain management, also in operations research and management science. So when we think about impact factor, it has a decent impact factor, but where the journal really stands out is its 5-year impact factor, which is astounding. What we have discovered is that articles that are published in JOM that really change the way people think or change the way people do things typically don't get cited for the first 2 or 3 years because people don't understand them. And then after a while, people say, oh, did they really say, oh, got it. And then what happens is that they start citing it like crazy. So, so we are very happy to focus on the 5-year impact factor. We're empirically focused, scholarly research. We try to balance academic and practical relevance. If the stuff that we do, I think that you just got a picture of that. My work is typical of what we go after at JOM, that we want to change the way people think, and we want to be at the forefront of analysis and of understanding of causal relationships, what's actually happening, how can we use models to inform what's happening. So we want it to be top scholarly research, but something should change in industry as a result of what we're doing. We have a departmental structure, 11 departments, 19 department editors. The EIC see all the submissions, but our main focus is on general editorial policy, the journal scope and direction. We manage the operations, the review process. We have been publishing forum articles where we invite thought leaders to come and take a position. That's been quite powerful. And then also external communication. So here are our departments. We have an empirical research methods department. The department editor is Guanji Shang. This department does 2 things. First of all, if we have papers that look at methods that are used in OM to try to facilitate them being well used in OM, then the paper can be published in that department. Or Guanji's department also will do a methods check. So if we get a manuscript that is using a new technique or that has some problems for example, with common method bias, then Gwenji's department can take a look at it to see if we can provide help to the authors to get the paper back on track. Then healthcare, innovation and project management, interorganizational relationships. Let me say a word about that. So that we have operations and that operations, papers about managing operations within one organization go to operational systems. But interorganizational relationships, we're looking at operations that take place between different organizations. This turns out to be quite important. This one type of this would be a supply chain, but there are many other examples. So we didn't want to limit ourselves to supply chains. We wanted to broaden it to operations that take place between different organizations. Intervention-based research. So in intervention-based research, we are looking at the idea that where you go and you try something, you tend to learn things. And sometimes you learn that your tool or your theory works just great, in which case it's not going to be a JOM paper, it's going to be a practitioner-oriented journal. But sometimes you learn that, gee, we thought we had it all figured out, then we went and we implemented it, and the craziest stuff happened. So that can give us good clues about what else we need to know to capture this knowledge. Operations interfaces, how do operations interact with marketing, with finance, public policy, that we look at the role of operations in public policy, both what do people who are setting public policy need to understand about operations? For example, the stuff that I've done with Sue Helper. Sue Helper was then the founding department editor for our public policy department. And the reason that she's not department editor is that she's back in the Biden administration. So she's back in Washington. And then also, then how should operations be thinking about taking public policy into consideration? So the question that Derek asked about context, I wouldn't so much look at national context, but public policy can have a big role. Then strategy and organization, sustainable operations, and then technology management. So I can give you a look at what flows look like at the journal. Here's what 2020 looked like as of the end of July. So we had received 690 new submissions. About a third of those were desk rejections by Tyson or me. And then 2/3 went to department editors, guest editors, and then 15% are desk rejections with involvement of a department editor. So you see we're about 50% desk rejections, which is better than it used to be. We're trying to get that better by more clearly communicating what our expectations are. And then of papers that went out for review, 17% were rejected, 26% received rejection with resubmit. So what this means is that we have a 4-person review team, the department editor, the associate editor, and at least 2 reviewers, maybe 3 reviewers, who have taken a look at the paper, and they think there's something there, but they don't see a path to publication for this particular manuscript, and that if their comments were addressed, the manuscript would be so different that it wouldn't really be a revision, it would be a new submission. But we don't want to waste all of that. We have pretty strong reviewers, so that by the time 4 or 5 people have gone through the manuscript and given comments under Tyson's or my guidance, we have a lot of information. So we want to make sure that if the authors are able to pull this together, we'd like to provide support. So we offer a decision called rejection with possibility to resubmit. And that was 26% of our submissions last year. 2% of manuscripts are under revision. 14 have been accepted, which is about 2%. And then 5 submissions were withdrawn by authors. So that gives you a feeling of what happens to manuscripts that come to us. Again, for 2020, 416 manuscripts went to departments and special issues. You see that interorganizational relationships is where a lot of papers go, ditto for sustainable operations, then special issues, technology management special issues tend to get quite many. Then we're starting to get more papers for public policy and intervention-based research, even those are relatively new departments. Anyway, so operational systems is another department that has quite a bit. Oh, innovation and project management also is a relatively new department and is starting to get a reasonable number of submissions. We are going to have our first issue that is all innovation and project management papers that's coming out quite soon. Tyson was interested in the question, what is the duration of a first round review? So he took 139 manuscripts that he handled that went out for first round review. And we think my numbers are probably quite similar. This is between the period January 1st to July 29th, January 1st, 2019 to July 29th, 2020. Our goal is 90 days for the first round review. We have a pretty heavy structure because given the richness of the papers that we handle, we want to really bring the team together and do everything possible to make papers go forward as best they can. What we saw was that the average was 80 days, but we did see that there were some papers that took a lot longer than the 90 days. So not terrible, but we are working with review teams to try to improve the turnaround time. And then we have some very exciting special issues, some that are in the pipeline. One is mobility, climate change, and economic inequality, and then technology management in a global context that received 35 submissions, global operations and supply chain management in the context of dynamic international relations. So going back to Derek's question, this is a special issue that you should be watching out for, because I think that they are answering the kind of question that you asked. And then managing the marketing operations interface and omni-channel retail. We received 113 submissions for the effects of COVID-19 on global supply chains. That has been pretty crazy. One that has just closed is operations management in the sharing economy. That's turned out to be quite interesting. And then operations management in the age of digital transformation. These two have just closed. And then governing large interorganizational projects that has a deadline at the end of October. Then we have some new special issues, embracing the unpredicted and unpredictable operations and supply chain management strategies for a post-COVID world. Closed loop supply chains with product remanufacturing, operational excellence for utilities, and then a couple of others. So special issues have been a source of a lot of exciting manuscripts. We've been working to grow and invigorate the field of operations and supply chain management. We've been trying to increase the solution space for papers, looking at things like warrants, replication, empirically grounded analytical modeling, empirically grounded research questions. Forum articles let us explore interesting and impactful OM topics where we need to go, before we do research, we need to go and have the conversation about what matters. And then we are doing everything that we can to offer developmental reviews. And then we are working to incubate and develop researchers and reviewers, build community, and then produce special issues. Let me draw your attention to a couple of webinars that we put up on our website that have been, that people have found quite helpful in terms of thinking about contributing to knowledge in the field. So Miko Ketokivi and Saku Mantere both had a forum piece, and they did a webinar on warrant. So the idea is that as we go from data to making a knowledge claim, then it doesn't just happen. Like the knowledge claim doesn't emerge by itself from the data. There is logical analysis and arguments that underlie the claim that is made. So we're working with arguments and plausibility rather than proof. And there is also a point where we move from induction to abduction. Or for those of us who are working more with analytical modeling, from induction and or deduction, so algorithmic or computational work, to abduction, where we say, this is surprising. We need to think about this. This could be an explanation. Once we recognize that that is going on and we describe it and make it part of the paper, we write better papers that reviewers are better able to understand. We don't get stuck in stupid questions. We use our logic. We think, if I were arguing this in front of a jury of my peers in a court of law, how would I try to convince them, as opposed to, to saying the data shows. No, the data needed a lot of help to show this. We are also looking at replication. There is a replication crisis. People have been told replicate more. It didn't happen. But Mark Pagel wrote a forum piece that also goes with a webinar that looks at how we can design a new study to simultaneously replicate existing work. And it's a nice way of thinking. We did a very fun webinar on OM and the sharing economy. So the sharing economy is turning out to have some elements that take operations to a whole new level. And one of the things that Tyson and I emphasize is that science is learning from observation. So what happened was that we invited journalist and advocate Christopher Elliott to join the session because he's in the front lines fixing things that go wrong. His website, if you've never seen anything that Christopher Elliott has done, and if you would like to have your hair stand on end, go Google him. Because when the sharing economy, and also some traditional economy stuff, but the sharing economy is really amazing. When it goes wrong, it goes really wrong. And then that gives us a chance to justify using reasonable parameters, which means crazy parameters in our analysis. It also emerged that arbitration is an important and overlooked element in the system. So in this webinar, we also brought one of the leading names in arbitration, Professor Christopher Drahozal, and who said, wait, the way that you all think about arbitration is completely different from how anybody is thinking in the entire arbitration space. We really need more of what you're doing. So that was fun. We have been working to encourage empirically grounded analytical modeling. If there's just a model, it does not fit at JOM. But if we are looking at a model as helping us organize empirical data, that can be very interesting. So we're trying to support authors who are doing this. And then a final thing to think about is the idea that sometimes the contribution of a study is not a generalization, but sometimes it is the right question to ask, which we call an empirically grounded research question. So we are open to papers that are looking at what question we need to ask based on what has been observed. So if we compare this to epidemiology, we use epidemiology and also like mouse models to gain insight into what are the clinical trials to run, because clinical trials are very expensive. We can't just run them. So that webinar is also up on the JOM website. So with that, I will finish.